Space Marines are one of, if not the most versatile army that you can run on the tabletop. They've got a little bit of everything, from fast-moving jump-back intercessors to lumbering dreadnoughts to the oppressive repulsor tank. Space Marine armies can run a list with a fighting chance against almost any opponent. And don't get me started on all the chapter-specific units. But just because Space Marines have a lot of variety, doesn't mean it's all good. So, in this video series, I'm going to rank every Space Marine unit you can run in a general list. These are units any Adeptus Astartes player can run, and won't include chapter-specific units like the Primarchs or the Emperor's Champion. Grab a model and some paint, because we're going to be here a while. And also because you should seriously reduce the size of your shame pile. For real though, get to painting. And welcome back to Starhammer. So, the way we're going to do this is we're going to have a video for each category. So, characters, battle line and infantry, and vehicles. Starting with vehicles, we're going to begin with one of my favorites, the Dreadnoughts. You've got 4 different ones you can choose from, but generally speaking, they're all pretty solid and offer a great deal of options for heavy support for your infantry. First up, we've got the Ballistas. Dreadnoughts all have the same general stat block, except for one that we'll get to in a minute, and they're pretty damn tanky. With a high toughness and a 2-up save and 12 wounds, Dreadnoughts are going to put up a fight before they get taken down. The Ballistas is your ranged model, rocking only 3 shooting weapons in the form of a las cannon, missile launcher that can fire AT or AP rounds, and a storm bolter. It has exceptional range on the 2 bigger guns, and with that missile launcher, it can counter mobs or light vehicles whenever needed. The Ballista's strike ability is a sort of discount Oath of Moment, wherein if you're shooting at a target that isn't below half strength, you can reroll your hit roll. Remember that it does stack with Oath of Moment, so you can effectively get 2 rerolls on your shots on one target if you play your cards right. So you're doubling your chances of doing some damage. Being as how this is a ranged unit, the only melee option it has available is its feet. It might get the job done against infantry that charge it, but really you want to keep this thing at a distance, or else it's going to get chewed up pretty quickly. It's a solid little dude, and for 140 points, it's a low cost and effective vehicle to run in your list, even if it only does have a couple of options for ranged combat. Given all that, I think it sits at a very comfortable B tier. Now we're going to take a look at the Dreadnought. That's it. It's just called Dreadnought. This is the worst of the 4, as you can see here with the stat block. It's got an okay toughness and wound pool, and it'll put up a fight with that 2-up save, but at the end of the day, it's pretty squishy compared to the other Dreads and many other vehicles. Maybe that's because this is the older Boxnought model and is therefore an older pattern of Dreadnought and isn't as tough as the Primaris chassis. I'm not sure, but that's the explanation that makes sense to me. Anyway, what it lacks in its ability to be a bullet sponge, it makes up for in an impressive amount of war gear. It has a gun for every situation. You've got short-range bolters and a heavy flamer, mid-range meltas, a missile launcher, and the options for plasma or laser as your main gun if you don't want the assault cannon and need something with a bit more oomph. But the main default loadout of an assault cannon, storm bolter, melta, and missile launcher are pretty damn good as they are. Here's the whole shebang for loadout options if you want to see it in black and white. For melee, it's pretty solid if you run the Dreadnought close combat weapon option. I've got no idea what that's supposed to be. With most close combat weapons, I tend to imagine them as like bayonets or combat knives. For this guy, I'd imagine it to be more like a giant Gundam sword, but use your own imagination. Aura abilities are few and far between with Space Marines in 10, but that's what makes this Boxnought unique. With the ability of the Wisdom of the Ancients, any Astartes unit that's within 6 inches can reroll a hit roll of 1 whenever they make an attack. Y'all know I'm a big fan of rerolls, and even just 1 can make all the difference in taking an objective or bringing down a unit. So you're going to run this guy with your infantry pushing points despite his lighter armor. Don't despair though. If he explodes, he's only doing deadly demise 1 to everyone within 6 inches, so you shouldn't get punished too hard for running him up the field with his buddies. With his squishy demeanor, he's probably going to get blasted fairly quickly. However, if you get him within weapon range, he might be able to throw down some hurt before he does, and give your infantry the rerolls they need to take a point. You can get a lot more out of the other dreads, but the Boxnought isn't really bad or really good, so for 130 points, I think it deserves C tier. Being able to chew up enemies at range is all well and good, but what about close quarters? Well, the Brutalis Dreadnought has got your back. Coming in at 160 points, this towering, claw-fingered menace should be your go-to for melee vehicles, especially considering it's the only dedicated one for Space Marines. We've got that good stat block again, and only a few ranged options. You've got Brutalis bolt rifles, twin heavy bolters, and an Icarus Iron Hail heavy stubber. You can swap out heavies for a Melta and bolt rifles and your default melee options for Brutalis claws, which is what you're going to want to do. But we don't care about the range damage for this guy. That's just to soften up targets for the horrific war crimes this dude is going to commit in melee. Remember, it's only a war crime if there are witnesses. With Brutalis Talons, this guy can rip and tear pretty much anything in your fight phase and does mortals on the charge with the aptly named Brutalis Charge ability. I main Black Templars, as you all know, and I typically make my list lean into melee, and I will never go without this guy. Pro tip, he also gets the melee buffs from your Templar vows, so he can have lethals, sustained 1, or anti-psyker 4 up if you're facing Thousand Sons or Eldar, for example, and it makes him even deadlier than you would have been otherwise. You can also target him with the tank charge stratagem and get even more mortals on that charge. Might be a little biased here, but I don't really care. Brutalis is super cool and a killing machine, so I'm putting him in a fat S tier, especially if you run Templars. Lastly, we've got the Redemptor Dreadnought at 210 points. This dude is another favorite of mine because he's like the Chad version of the Boxnought. He's got that sweet Dreadnought stat block and ranged weapons and combos to deal with pretty much any enemy on the board. What I really want to point out is that you can swap out his chain gun for a plasma cannon, and you should absolutely be doing that. He can also hold his own quite well in melee, and his ability, Duty Eternal, subtracts 1 from the damage characteristic of any attacks that get through to him. The Redemptor has even better guns than the Boxnought. It is another excellent all-purpose unit that will not disappoint. Not a lot left to say. He's got great stats, great weapons, and damage dealing potential, and because of all of this, he's going to join the Brutalis up in S tier. Do you like ODSTs? Those guys that drop from the sky right into the heat of battle? Me too. Sometimes I like to bring a little ODST to my Warhammer game with a Space Marine drop pod, usually without the sad jazz and ambient stormy weather though. At 70 points, the drop pod isn't all that special in terms of stats or damage dealing potential. What we're going to pay attention to though is its ability. The pod has to start the battle in reserve, but neither it nor the units embarked within it count towards your usual limit on reserve models. It can be set up in the reinforcement step of any movement phase. Yeah, even your first one. And it can be set up anywhere on the field within 9 inches of any enemy model. You can drop this bitch on a point turn 1 and dump out some crazy good defensive units like Blade Guard vets and get a strategic advantage right out the gate. If you're lucky, you can even score with these pods and the associated unit on your second battle round. So the potential for early points is there too, with your secondary objectives that you might get. It also can't move once it's dropped, so you could also use it as a bulwark of sorts to cover the rear or close off a route from the enemy. It obscures your infantry, and it acts as a decent stationary that provides covering fire as well. It can carry up to 10 Adeptus Astartes models, though none of them can be fancy ones like Gravis or Terminator units. At 70 points, and based on its incredible utility, I gotta put the drop pod in B tier. I was thinking A, but considering its lack of real combat output and low OC, I think B tier suits it a little better. So, here we have Firestrike servo turrets. I've never used one of these on the field before personally, but I have had them used against me, and I gotta say they ain't half bad. At 75 for 1 or a whopping 150 for 2, they have a pretty understandable stat block for what they are, but they can hit like a truck. Their potential damage output for either weapon is pretty solid, though I'd stick with the autocannon option for a little bit more consistency. Either one has decent range, and they're twin links, so you can reroll any wound rolls you might fail, though the laser option is good if you're more of a gambler. Moving only 3 inches is also a huge hindrance even with an advanced roll, so it's a total slog getting them up the field, but again, it makes sense. However, their Sentinel Protocol ability allows them to hit on a 4 up when firing Overwatch, so that's pretty solid. There's not a ton to say about these. I hardly ever see anyone run them, and for 150 for 2 of them, that seems a bit steep in terms of points cost. They're not bad units by any means, not great either. I think they deserve a pretty average C tier. Let's talk about some tanks, specifically Gladiator tanks. We've got the Lancer, Reaper, and Valiant variants that we can choose from. The Lancer is going to run you 160 points, which I think is pretty fair. It has pretty solid stats as it is a tank. It can move quickly, and it can take a little bit of punishment with that 3-up save and 12 wounds. The war gear options are also pretty solid as well, having a decent spread of anti-infantry, anti-armor, and anti-air weapons, with the Storm Bolters able to be swapped for frag launchers if you want a bit more anti-infantry capability. The Aquilin Optics ability allows you to milk a little more out of your Oath of Moment by letting you reroll a hit roll as well as a wound and a damage roll. Fairly straightforward, I'd say. Pretty cheap in points and pretty solid all around, but I think it's a little soft for a tank. So we'll place this little guy in a cozy B tier. The Reaver variant, it's going to run you 160 points as well, and this is going to be your big infantry killer. Same stats as before, but as you can see, all of its guns are dedicated to killing infantry models and maybe some light vehicles if it came down to it. The Gatling cannon also gets sustained 2 when targeting infantry units thanks to its appropriately named rotating death ability. Let's put this fella in the B tier as well. Great unit for fighting horde armies like orcs or tyrannids. So if your pod is running a lot of those sorts of things, looking at you, Jared and Tyler. This is a great counter to all of that. Lastly, the Valiant is coming in at, you guessed it, 160 points. This is supposed to be a vehicle killer, and for its point cost, I'd say it's pretty good. Its weapons are geared towards anti-heavy strategy, and its ability, Ferocious Assault, lets you add 1 to the hit roll on his giant laser gun when targeting the nearest monster or vehicle unit. Couple that with Oath of Moment, and you got a pretty decent chance of actually bringing something down. Also, there's not a ton to say here, but I think this tank, like its siblings, deserves a comfortable B tier. I don't see gladiators all that often on tabletop, but that doesn't mean they aren't suitable units. I think for the points cost, all 3 are pretty solid options if you need something heavy hitting but don't want to fork out the points for an executioner or something big like that. Coming up, we have some of my favorite vehicles in terms of aesthetics, the Land Raiders. They come in 3 flavors: Land Raider, Land Raider Crusader, and Land Raider Redeemer. So regular, diet, sugar-free. The Land Raider is the one that I run, and it costs a hefty 240 points, but for good reason. Land Raiders are the ultimate assault vehicle. They can generally hold their own in battle, as the weapon options here suggest, but the best part is that they have the assault ramp ability. This allows any embarked units that disembark after the Land Raider is moved to make a charge, as opposed to having to wait a turn. This is fantastic for storming a point with units like Sword Brothers or Assault Intercessors and allow you to strike hard and fast. The massive profile of any Land Raider also provides great cover for other infantry models to move up on a point without taking fire. And the vehicle itself has some great stats that allow it to soak up bullets and lasers and all that, all while providing some solid fire support. There's a lot of debate on which Land Raider is best, but I personally enjoy the default because of its more expansive loadout options compared to the other 2. The folks I play with typically run big units, so I like to do everything I can to cover my squads and support them on that charge. The more rounds I can put down range, the better, as far as I'm concerned. There's really no huge difference between them besides some minor war gear changes, which I'll throw up right now. The Crusader will run you 220 and the Redeemer a whopping 285. Personally, I think the Redeemer should be about 220 as well, and it certainly has a better loadout for camping on a point, but I still think it's a bit too expensive, considering they all do the same thing. Every one of these is absolutely fantastic, so I'm putting the Land Raider in the S tier. Doesn't get much better than fast moving cover with the ability to storm points and take names. The Invictor Tactical Warsuit is a fun little discount dreadnought, which will come in at 140 points. Which I think is pretty fair. It comes with a decent stat block and a lot of good options for dealing with infantry, as well as some heavier units with that S9 twin-linked autocannon and melee attack. Its aura ability is combat support. With this, the warsuit can make a shooting attack once per turn on your opponent's shooting phase, after that opponent has selected a friendly Astartes model within 6 inches of the Invictor to be a target. Remember, they can only shoot back at that shooting unit, and only if it's within range and an eligible target. Pretty alright unit. I give it a B. Predator tanks are really good anti-big guy units and come in either the Annihilator or Destructor patterns, both for 130 points. Predators have the option to wield 2 las cannons, allowing you to dish out a pretty impressive amount of wounds for their point cost. The Annihilator is more anti-vehicle geared with its Annihilator ability, allowing him rerolls of 1 on vehicles or monsters, and the Destructor is for anti-infantry with the ability Destructor, which improves weapon AP against infantry targets by 1 to help get around pesky cover saves. These things are pretty darn cool, and if you want some serious killing power while not eating your points allowance, I think Predators are the way to go. Get on in the A tier there, little buddies. You've earned it. The Repulsor tank is a lot like the Predator, but tankier. Coming in at 180 points, has a pretty fat stat block with that points hike, as well as the war gear. its ability is also really silly. Emergency Combat Embarkation allows an Astartes unit within 3 inches that isn't engaged to hop in this as a transport when they become the target of a charge, thereby forcing your opponent to find a new target to run at. That was a way more concise description than the real one, believe me. This thing is sort of like a worse Land Raider in that regard. I think you get more bang for your buck out of literally any other tank, even the regular old Land Raider. Honestly, it's mid C tier. Now, the Repulsor Executioner puts the regular version to shame. Coming in at a huge 220 points, this has the same stat block as the Repulsor, but packs way more of a punch in terms of firepower. If you aren't running this thing with the heavy laser destroyer, you're wrong. Check yourself into the mental asylum right now. With 7 really good weapons to fire, the Executioner lives up to its name, especially with that laser destroyer. I like to keep this elevated if I can, because then it doesn't have to move much and has a better view of the field. And because it's not moving, I get to take advantage of that heavy bonus as much as possible. But just in case you do have to move around and get that killing blow, the Executioner ability has you covered, allowing you to add 1 to your hit rolls when targeting a unit below half strength. Yeah, it's an expensive point sink, but it's gonna rip through just about anything on the board pretty easily. Given its killing power, mobility, and ability, I'm gonna put this Chad up in the S tier. I am 7 pages into this script, but we still haven't found anything that's terrible. Until now. Moving on to Storm Speeders. I've got mixed feelings about these. On one hand, I can see how they'd be really useful. On the other hand, they're only good for extremely specific situations. We have 3 different types: Hail Strike, Hammer Strike, Thunder Strike. Points wise, they're all pretty great, but everything else about them, not so much. Starting with the Hail Strike, 130 points. Stats aren't too bad, especially the juicy 14-inch movement, but other than that, not a lot to write home about. Its weapons aren't horrible, I guess. Pretty solid for taking on regular infantry, but not much else. Its Hail Strike ability is unique in that whenever this unit targets an enemy, except for monsters and vehicles, it marks that target. In doing so, every Astartes unit that makes an attack against that unit gets to add 1 to the weapon's AP. That could be kind of handy in getting around cover bonuses or bringing down bigger infantry like Scorpex or something like that, but again, kind of situational. Due to how squishy it is and the average and best everything else, I'm going to give the Hail Strike a D ranking. The Hammer Strike comes in at a slightly higher point cost, but that's because it's a little bit more useful. Same stats as before, but the damage dealing potential is a bit beefier. It gets fewer attacks, but those attacks are going to hurt a little bit more. This guy is great for harassing light vehicles or heavy infantry, and the Hammer Strike ability takes the benefit of cover away from a unit that was hit by 1 or more attacks of the speeder. Now, that is monumental, especially if your map uses a lot of ruins and such. That ability might force your opponent to play a little more conservatively and keep powerful and more valuable units back and out of range of this thing. I think this has slightly more utility than the Hail Strike, so I'm going to place it in a C tier, though honestly it's only because of that ability. The Thunder Strike is our last speeder at 160 points. This dude is going to be your vehicle killer. Same stats, but you've got significantly beefier guns than the other 2. But also very few attacks. The Thunder Strike ability is pretty good in that it lets you add 1 to the wound rolls against monsters or vehicles, as well as other friendlies that shoot the same monster or vehicle. Now that's pretty cool, but not enough to make it good. The Thunder Strike suffers from Eldari syndrome, in where it hits like a truck and zooms, but it's going to get squished very quickly if your opponent knows what they're doing. All in all, I'd give it a D tier. Mediocre at best. All 3 have the Deep Strike ability, allowing you to dump them behind enemy lines later in the game. That's cool, I guess. But these speeders function best when they have a lot of room to maneuver and cover to bounce from while they do hit and run attacks on targets. I know I find these things more annoying than anything, so if I'm up against them, I smack them down as quickly as possible, but I guess that's their whole shtick. However, for distraction units, you can get something better for less with a solid infantry unit. I used to think jets were really cool, until I used one on the tabletop. Then I sold my models of them and never looked back. Let's get into the true flyers and see if the Astartes are any good at air superiority. The Stormhawk Interceptor will run you at 155 points, and I'd say that's pretty good points to capability ratio. Its stats are alright, I think, but there's one thing I want to call attention to that we haven't seen before, and that is the 20+ inch movement. This means that this aircraft has to move a minimum 20 inches. If for some reason it fails to do so, then it counts as destroyed. As a general rule, aircraft can't enter the field of battle until the reinforcement step of your second turn at the earliest, and must take that minimum move every movement phase. One exception to this is if that aircraft has the hover keyword, which will allow you to keep it stationary and deploy it as a normal unit. However, Some aircraft don't have this, so keep that in mind. It has a pretty average selection of war gear and a couple options to swap for depending on the game, as you can see. As always, war gear is tethered to your personal playstyle. Personally, I like my vehicles to hit a little harder most of the time, but hey, you do you. The Stormhawk is really only good for fighting other aircraft and doing the occasional gun run on an enemy point. And this is reflected in its interceptor ability, which gives it a +1 to hit on any attacks against flying units. One thing I want you to bear in mind is that more units than aircraft have the flying keyword. Necron Wraiths are a ground unit that have the fly keyword, so you could benefit from your interceptor ability on more units than you might think. If you suspect a unit might fly, ask your opponent to read their keywords just to be sure you aren't screwing yourself out of any potential buffs. Stormhawk isn't bad, it's not great. Like the speeders, it's situational, more so than anything else we've talked about. I have quite a bit of experience running this when I used to play Grey Knights, and it just never seemed worth the points cost. There are several other units you can get for the same or similar points that'll just serve you better. Stormhawks get smacked with a D tier. The Storm Raven gunship comes sweeping down at 280 points. It's honestly pretty good. It can take quite a beating with the stats it has, it can hover, and has a sizable war gear loadout with a few options you can customize, as always. It also functions as a very nice transport, capable of transporting 12 standard Astartes infantry models and a Dreadnought. Its armored resilience ability lets it have the damage characteristics of attacks that get through to it, and this thing is basically an airborne tank. You can dump a lot of hate downrange with its war gear, but do understand that it will become a target very quickly. It is a potent transport, especially considering it can move dreadnoughts across the battlefield and kill off a lot of ground troops with its guns. I highly recommend not keeping this one in one spot for too long if you can help it. Use it as a fast-moving, heavy transport, and make sure it zooms around, because if this thing gets shot down on a point you're trying to take and it rolls a deadly demise, it's going to deal D6 mortals to anything under it. Stormraven is a solid unit, but has a prohibitively high points cost. I guess that's not entirely bad considering what it can do, but it'll take up a sizable chunk of your budget, so use it wisely. All in all, I think the Stormraven sits comfortably in B tier. Storm Talon is kind of like the Stormhawk, but better at hitting ground targets. At 165 points, it's actually a little weaker than the Interceptor, but has pretty good default war gear. The Strafing Run ability even lets you add 1 to the hit roll against targets that don't fly. And as I said, the war gear is going to excel at this. So keep this guy blasting points as he zooms around the map and force your enemy to stay in cover out of range of anything else. The Storm Talon does better at board control than the other two flyers we've reviewed thus far, but it's extremely squishy, and something like a couple of well-placed crack rockets is going to turn it into Swiss cheese. Plugging it into the moist meter, that'll give it a comfortable C rank. The Vindicator tank. I run one of these with my 1000 Suns, but it's the same vehicle as the Astartes one, more or less. At 175 points, this little dude is a very cheap and very solid little tank. His stats are pretty good, but your war gear options are limited, as you can see. That's alright though. All we care about is that giant ass demolisher cannon that's going to erase whoever is unlucky enough to stand in range of it. The other really neat thing is the Siege Shield ability, which allows you to fire this main blast weapon while engaged with enemy units, provided no other friendlies are engaged with you. This will have your opponents thinking twice about charging the Vindicator, allow you to keep him back and keep him blasting. But given his limited loadout and short range, the Vindicator's power is forever restrained. That being said, I'm kinda torn on where to place him. Given his high points to limited weapons capability though, I think I'm gonna give him a C tier. This one's honestly pretty tough for me, so let me know what you all think. The Whirlwind is a unique vehicle for Astartes, coming in at 180 points. Astartes don't have a ton of indirect fire support units, but the Whirlwind fills that role with its Vengeance launchers, giving you 72 inches of infantry and light vehicle killing power at a 3 up to hit with D6 plus 3 attacks. Anything hit by that also has to make a battle shock test, which could really throw a wrench in your opponent's plans if they don't make the roll. Outside of that though, the Whirlwind doesn't do a whole lot. It has a decent enough stat block for sure, but if you're doing anything besides plopping it on your home objective, I'd say you're playing it wrong. While it can be quite useful in forcing battle shock and thinning infantry bricks, it doesn't have much else going for it. I mean, I don't think it's a bad unit, but not a great one. For 180 points, I think it's a bit much, so I think he's going into the C tier for me. Let's finish out strong with our dedicated transports. We got the Impulsor, the Razorback, and the Rhino. The Impulsor is a little hover taxi that'll run you 80 points. This thing is sort of like a discount Land Raider, and I'll get to why in a second. It's a light transport, and it's fast, and the stats reflect that. The surprising part is that this little thing can pack quite a punch with all its weapon options and gear abilities. If you're running with the Orbital Comms Array, you roll a d6 for a unit within 6 inches that you just targeted with a stratagem, and on a 5-up, you gain a CP. So you can net a positive from using an expensive strat or regen that lost CP you just used. With the Shield Dome, you can give it a 5-up invulnerable save, which can really help out in keeping it around a little longer. It can transport up to 6 regular infantry models and has firing dex 6, meaning that those transported models can shoot out from the transport as well. The assault vehicle ability allows you to disembark even after the transport has advanced, though it does make that disembarked unit ineligible to charge, unlike the Land Raider. You can't advance and charge with the Land Raider though, so just keep that in mind still. That's alright, because it can still get you to that critical objective promptly, and early control can easily make or break a game. It's a little squishy, but this is a fantastic little vehicle to run. Not only is it fast and can transport a squad, but it also allows them to shoot while remaining out of harm's way as they're en route to a point. And it can cover them when they disembark and do a pretty good job of it. With all that said, I think the Impulsor deserves to be up with the greats in B tier. The Rhino is, kind of shit, if I'm being honest. For 75 points though, you get what you pay for. Stats are on par for a light vehicle, and only has 2 war gear options. It has firing deck 2, so only 2 transported models can shoot from within it, and with that self-repair ability, it regains a single wound in your command phase. It does transport up to 12 standard models, however, so you can transport full squads, but it lacks the assault mobility of the Impulsor. Besides the increased transport capacity though, there's really no upside to taking one of these except for a means of cheap transport and fodder once it has fulfilled its role. Solid F tier, honestly. Invest your points in something with more utility. Our last unit to rank is the Razorback for 95 points, which I think is a little much. Same stats as the Rhino, but slightly better in terms of utility. It can transport only 6 standard infantry, and it actually has heavy bolters, which can be slightly better at providing covering fire, especially at short range. Its fire support ability marks a target, for lack of a better term, that the Razorback just shot at, and allows the disembarked squad it was carrying to re-roll their wound rolls when targeting the same unit. So it's a little bit more beneficial to your infantry models with that. Still, that doesn't save it from being kind of bad. Not totally useless like the Rhino, so I'll be nice and give it a low D rank. And that's it for this one, y'all. That's my honest opinion on the best and the worst of the Astartes vehicles on tabletop. I'll probably do characters next if this video does alright, so don't forget to comment and like if you want to see another ranking list. Let me know what you think in the comments, and let me know how you would rank them. As always, subscribe if you really liked it, check my community tab for shitposts and shenanigans, and follow me on Instagram. I'll see y'all in the next one. Toodles.